a few specific mechanisms regarding Java, so you get some idea of what I'm going to be talking about in the tutorials. So we're going to be talking about a couple things in the context of these tutorials. One thing will be the Java basics of Java syntax. I'm going to be introducing a variety of values that can be used within any logic and talking about the role of expressions, these sort of formulas we've seen within any logic models, and giving examples of these and talking about how to sort of read these formulas. How do you understand what they mean? A few basic principles can go a long way about sort of how to make sense of them, okay? These so-called expressions, these formulas, compute values, and they allow us to compute, for example, a rate, or allow us to find a person with certain attributes. We're going to be introducing a notion of a variable in Java, which will be sort of a name for a value, and seeing how we can use these variables within Java to perform computations, and how we could use them to print things out, for example. Okay. We'll also see a variety of common so-called operators that modify values, modify variables. For example, we saw this plus plus operator. Does anyone remember what that meant? Plus plus? Yeah, adding one to it increments it. So it adds one to it, and it can be very useful for sort of compactly saying, okay, make this one bigger than it was before. And we'll learn to kind of how to work with this and what this means in the context when we have values that are references. Suppose our values point, as it were, point to people. What does it mean to manipulate those values using expressions like this? So if we have an expression like this, how do we actually interpret it? This is kind of a representation of what might be going on within the model, and we have a very particular meaning associated with expressions such as those above. So here we can reason about values that include not only things like numbers like 3.14 or integers like 5 or 0, but we can also reason about values that point to particular objects, point to a person or point to main. And learning how to manipulate those can be really important for sort of giving you clarity on what's going on in a model. So we'll be talking about how to read and understand expressions like this that we'll be seeing occasionally within our models. And a few basic pointers go a long way to really understanding that. We'll then be talking some about not just expressions, but these so-called Java statements. And statements are basically represent situations or sort of commands, cases where we ask it to do something for us. They're the things where we need the semicolons. And we'll talk about a variety of common statements, in this case, things like if statements, for statements, while statements, things that throw an error or detect an error, and understand how those statements work. So we saw this, for example, a brief time ago when we looked at how a statistic works behind the scenes, and we'll learn what that means and other common statement types. Okay, and I'll be explaining some of the features you see in models and sort of how to spot good quality statements and ones that really need to be improved for clarity. So we're going to be talking about some of the elements of statements. We're also going to be talking about this general notion of classes and objects. I noted that there's kind of the person class, which specifies personhood, and then there's particular people. And the analogy I like to use is sort of the distinction between a cookie cutter and particular cookies cut with that cutter. The cookie cutter defines the shape that each of those cookies is going to have, but those cookies vary with whether there are sprinkles on top. They vary with the particulars of the situation. A given cookie cutter can be used to produce many particular cookies, And so it is with a person class can be used to produce many particular persons, okay? So we're going to take a look at some of these, the ways in which we could use classes and ways we could use objects for classes, and how these combine to sort of be strung together in ways that will give useful values, okay? Expanding on some of that earlier understanding of how these objects are connected with one another. For example, a person having a mother. We saw that earlier. A person refers to their mother, who's also a person. And we'll see how that can be maintained and how we can get these references to these different people referred to by a given person. Okay? So we're going to see some information on classes and objects and their distinctions. We're going to also talk about methods, and methods provide a way of wrapping up functionality. We saw that today, and methods provide a way of sort of capturing at a single place certain types of functionality and using that functionality for many places, and hiding certain details and just making use of it from many places that don't need to know about all the sorts of details. So we define functions very commonly to wrap up certain types of details that we can just call off to rather than knowing about all the details of what they need to do their work. Okay? So we're going to learn how to define functions within these tutorials, like those we saw today, how to make use of them to clean up a model, to do it more cleanly. To implement the basic functionality more cleanly. We're also in the final little bits, we may get time to talk about collections, which are features that allow us to maintain sets of information. For example, you may want to maintain a set of information about the times at which a given person has been infected, or the times where a certain person has quit smoking. You may want to maintain information about the set of all people that have come into contact with me. And these are what are called collections. And Java offers a wide variety of collection types that are really useful. And so we'll see how to sort of maintain this information that's collected over time in a way that would allow us to export it. So if we want to get information on the history of a given agent, and we want to export that to a database or to an Excel spreadsheet, using collections is one of the best ways to do that. And AnyLogic provides within its interface a way to easily declare these sort of collections. So if you go up here, for example, with this simple SIR model, we could have a person defined, and then we could add to the person a collection which defines their times of infection or something like that. And over time, every time they are infected, we could add to this particular collection, we could add in a time to it. So times of infection, and add that in to the current time. And that would allow us to maintain information on when that person got infected. So we'll talk about the types of collections that Java offers as time allows. I think that will be most of what we can cover. We may also take a glimpse at this notion of a type hierarchy, how we can have agents, and there can be many types of agents in our model that are particular agent classes, things like person, or things like a name for an animal or a doctor. These would be particular agents. And even within doctors, we might have a hierarchy. So there's doctors, and then there's, orthopods, and there's folks who are internists, and there's folks who are psychiatrists, etc., and maintain a hierarchy of this sort. And we might add certain common attributes to doctors that are common to all. For example, they had a residency location and a training location. and then each of those specialized groups would have their own characteristics. So we'll see a little bit about how that's accomplished in AnyLogic. It's important because there's certain types of methods in AnyLogic which might return not a person, but an agent. And it turns out every person is an agent. And so we could use those methods without trouble if we have a bit of a context for understanding how we have this hierarchy. And persons are agents, and you can have multiple types of persons that are all considered persons. Doctors and patients would both be considered a person. So we'll see in our Java tutorials a little bit about how that works within Java, okay? This so-called type hierarchy, which will be useful for understanding certain error messages and for understanding how to use certain Java functionality within AnyLogic. I think that's what we have time for today. It's a little bit of a glimpse of what we'll be seeing and a little bit of a glimpse of how Java fits into AnyLogic. Regardless of whether you come to the AnyLogic tutorials, you may pick up a little bit here or there on the Java side. We'll be trying to weave in some basic knowledge of Java, but it's really here that you'll see a systematic discussion of what these things mean that you'll be exposed to. And it'll also help you make sense a little bit of some of the things that are going on as far as Java tools and looking at that code that came up. Okay? So that's all we have time for today. I'd be glad to answer any questions, and people can feel free to move on when needed. So any questions? No? Okay. So that's all for today. We'll see you at, I think it's 9 a.m. tomorrow? Yep. Great. Thanks very much. So you're going to talk about that. Yes, thank you.